Some people are describing the kinds of energies that are going into the Sanders campaign as part of a global phenomenon, right? So that we have Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, another self-described socialist who's now the head of the Labour Party in Britain, and in Greece, which has been burdened so traumatically by austerity policy. We have Alexis Tsipras of the left-wing Syriza party, who's been elected prime minister. And I was curious as to what you thought was if something is shared behind these candidacies, if something more universal is driving the kind of enthusiasm for the left in this moment.
Not just this moment. Yeah, there's something very common. It's called neoliberalism. This is a general assault on the world's population that takes different forms in different places, but is based on the same kinds of conceptions. And it's people have suffered everywhere. Every place that the neoliberal principles have been applied, it's been harmful to the general populations. In the United States, which is not harmed as much as others, a rich, powerful society, there's been basically stagnation or decline for about 30 years for a majority of the population. People are now arguing about the minimum wage, but if you take a look at the minimum wage, I presume you know this, through the huge growth period, 50s and 60s, it tracked productivity. That started to break in the late 70s when the neoliberal assault began. If the minimum wage had continued to do so, it would now probably be about $20 an hour. So when people are talking about $15 an hour, they're saying, let's keep it low. And that holds for everything. Real male wages are now roughly what they were in the late 60s. The figures just came out a couple days ago about median household incomes. They're now lower than they were 7 or 8 years ago. And it's been pretty flat ever since the Reagan-Thatcher neoliberal assault. And the same is true. It's taking a different form in Europe, a worse form in many ways. Greece, Spain, England have been targeted by very reactionary economic policies, even worse than here. The idea of austerity during recession, even the IMF thinks it's ridiculous. And from an economic point of view, yes, sure, it's an absurdity, but that doesn't mean it's foolish. It's a very good instrument of class war. It's undermining it's undermining the major achievements of Europe since the Second World War, both political and social and economic. What we call welfare state programs are being significantly undermined, England as well. And from the point of view of the people designing the policy, sure, they never liked these things, but let's get rid of them. And the same is happening almost everywhere. I mean, in England, it's almost startling to see, for example, England. The National Health Service has its flaws, like everything, but it's probably one of the best health systems in the world. They're now trying to make it like the American system, which may be the worst system in the world. Literally, about twice the per capita costs of other countries and some of the worst outcomes, extensive bureaucracy, inefficiency, enormous costs, poor outcomes. So let's become like them and destroy a successful system. The same is happening in Canada. These are just different manifestations of the neoliberal programs, and the resistance is not just starting now. The major resistance started in Latin America about 10 or 15 years ago. Latin America was a very loyal student of the neoliberal doctrines and of course suffered significantly. But about 10 or 15 years ago, they started to pull out of it, both economically and politically. In fact, one of Obama's supposed foreign policy achievements is the beginning of normalization of relations with Cuba. The way it's described here, Obama made this forthcoming noble gesture to bring Cuba out of its isolation. It's exactly the opposite. The United States was utterly isolated in the hemisphere. The last major hemispheric conference happened to be in Colombia, the last U.S. ally. The U.S. was practically thrown out of the hemisphere on this issue and on the drug war, two major issues. They couldn't reach a consensus because the U.S. and Canada wouldn't agree. The next hemispheric conference was going to be in Panama this year. And if the United States had not made some move on Cuba, it probably would have been thrown out of the hemisphere. For anyone who knows the history of the United States and the Western Hemisphere, that's utterly shocking. This was the backyard when you didn't worry about it. They do what you tell them. If they don't, you overthrow the government. You know, it's totally reversed. And this began as a reaction to the neoliberal policies, which they have slowly begun to pull themselves out of. It's now spread to Southern Europe. There are other manifestations here. So you're right, there's something global. It takes different forms in different places, but it has commonalities as well.